welcome back to my channel. Today is the continuation of the Lady Maria series, just in time for Halloween, and this is a tutorial on how I made my Rakuyo. The first thing that I was looking for in the process of making the Rakuyo was actually making it budget friendly. You'd be surprised to know that I made the blade portion of this weapon out of yardsticks from the Home Depot. Now, and at least in American stores, they cost less than $1. So I'm not sure whether or not I used one or two, but it really wasn't significant in terms of price. It was all less than $2. Years ago, I moved cross country, and before then I had an entire arsenal of woodworking tools. Now, I no longer have those, so I had to be very careful and selective on the things that I used. So that also means that if you have a very limited amount of resources, this is totally fine, as long as you have a small area outside, whether that is a porch or a yard, both would work, but I highly recommend working outside for these. So to start, I had the full yardstick. And I had the very painstaking task of having to sand all of the numbers which were carved into the blade off. Now, you could easily use a bit of pine if you do have, say, a jigsaw and a mouse sander. I think if I were to do it again with all of my tools at the ready, that's what I would do. But if you have a limited budget, this is absolutely something that you can do. I got a thick grit sandpaper, something like 80 grit, which is very, very coarse. And I had the arduous task of sanding it all off of the blade. So I started with that, and once the numbers were gone from each one, I went in with a 120 grit, which is much finer, and then I ended with something like a 200 or 220 grit. And what that did is that smoothed the blade out. Now, with all of the props that I make, I always prime it first. That saves you so much time in the end and makes the blade look so much smoother. Although I didn't have the initiative to make a video while these blades were made, I'm going to show some progress photos so that you can see some of the materials I used. From there, we move on to the hilt. Now, at the Home Depot, I also bought some PVC pipe, which is all of this hilt material here. And it makes it not only great to grip in your hand and also extremely light, it's also made to come apart and come together. So you see that it's apart now. You can either be awesome and snap it together, or you can be gentle and just put it together like that, and it stays. I also bought a PVC pipe connector piece that connected that size. If you're not sure, ask someone at the Home Depot, or you can just go get your PVC pipe, get your connector, put it on, see if it fits, and if it does, you're golden. Now, I like everything that I make to be extremely sturdy. The most frustrating thing for me in all of my years of making costumes was making something that would fall apart. Over the years, I just stopped doing that. I took the extra time to make things last, and really that made all of the difference. For this, I attached the PVC pipe, this hilt, to the blade by going in, drilling a hole, and screwing in a screw. And I did this by hand. You could use a drill, but because PVC pipe is so finicky and it's not porous like wood, the drill may end up slipping about, which could be dangerous, so I don't recommend doing that. I recommend just going in, maybe drilling a small hole if you can, or hammering in a nail in the area that you want to put the screw in. Then you can screw in by hand with a screwdriver, a good size screw. So although my lighting is weird and you probably can't see on the inside, you'll see that right around, oh my god, it's dusty. I masked the screws by putting a layer of foam over it. I put in 2 screws to keep it completely in place, and even after like wiggling it around, it won't budge. It's a very strong bond. So if you wanted to tack on before starting to screw in the screw, you can always use a little bit of super glue just to keep it in place for the time being while you're adding that screw in. From there, I started on the hilt decorations. Now, most of it is just a nice foam rubber that I like to use. You can use any type of foam. I recommend a thinner type of foam for this because then you can get all of those intricate details exactly the way that you want. To attach that connecting piece, I attached layers of foam to the hilt. So to make that detail, I put little strips of foam on first. So for this part that curves here, I used a 12 gauge wire, really something quite big, and then I wrapped foam around it, and then added a little bit of puff paint. Puff paint will be your savior for this. Now, I made this before all those really awesome 3D renders became a thing. So what I did here was I thought of some of the custom designs that Lady Maria would most likely have on her sword, and I picked a flower like this one. So I used puff paint to draw in the flower. I just did it freehand like this before painting. And as you can see, I did the same for the other side. And for this, it was very similar. You just add a little bit of craft foam details before painting. Now the dagger part I found to be a little bit more elaborate. The really high quality 3D renders were not out yet. I recommend using those 3D renders if you're going to make the sword now, because you can potentially make it even better and more detailed than I did. What I did was I downloaded a very high resolution picture of the Rakuyo, and I just tried to figure out what it would likely have as a design. This here is a layer of foam that I put on top, and all of these designs I did in puff paint first for the texture before painting. For the hilt here, again, I couldn't see the design very well on my own, so I just made up what I felt would be appropriate. So for this part here, I love that the vile blood symbol, or the Canehurst symbol, really does look like an ankh mixed with DNA. And that's what I ended up doing. I painted a double helix design that resembles DNA. Then I went on to paint the sword. So I started with a layer of primer. For all of my props, I like to put on at least one, if not two layers of primer before painting. What primer does is it helps to seal the material, in this case wood and foam, which is both porous, and then prime it for painting. I did use a sander friendly paint, so what I would do is I did one layer of the primer, I sanded it all down so that it was completely smooth, and I did one more layer to seal it and make sure that it was capable of adding a true bit of realism. From there it got a little bit more detailed. I painted the blade first by covering all of the rest of this with blue painter's tape. Now that comes on and off completely safe without stripping away any of that hard work that you just did. So I put on the blue painter's tape as well as some newspaper to cover any part which would end up being black before going forward and painting my blade. I painted it with a Rust-Oleum silver hammered paint. And now what that does is it adds a wee bit of texture. It makes it look like hammered metal, which I really love. I used to use things like chrome paints, but I found that chrome paints, one, don't dry well in heat and humidity, which is the climate that I live in. And number two, over time, it stops looking just as beautiful as when you painted it. So I usually play it pretty safe and use a hammered paint instead of a chrome paint. From there, I took off the painter's tape, let the blade dry completely before adding more painter's tape onto the gray areas, and then used newspaper to cover that all up. And then of course I painted the hilt black. From there, I went in with a gold acrylic paint, and in parts like here on the hilt and in this curved part, I dry brushed a very, very thin layer to give it that realistic texture that you can see. To me, that was really important. I think that was the first time I really did a dry brush on a prop, and it came out really beautiful, so I really loved the results that I got. And then once that was all done, I went in with a very concentrated small brush and I painted the remainder of the details gold. Now, the good part about props is that it's not like sewing where you have to be extremely precise to almost to the point of pain. So right here on the end of the dagger, there's a lot of wear and tear from me popping it in and out like a doofus. Stupid chair. My chair is stupid. So what I did was I just kind of worked with it. I took a silver Sharpie and just Sharpied in where it had worn off, so now it just looks like a worn blade. Speaking of weathering, after all was said and done, I ended up weathering the blades with black acrylic paint, and I went on pretty dry with a small to medium sized brush. And I brushed in ever so slightly any nook or cranny so that it gives it that aged, worn-in look. I really love that for a prop, and I think it looks absolutely beautiful on any costume sword. I did forget to mention before, but I'll say it now, that for this part of the hilt, I drilled in a hole straight through the PVC pipe so that I could run the 12 gauge wire right through. And then I glued it to seal. Over the years, I started to resent using hot glue, so instead I use super glue. It's a fairly good glue for metal, but it is an excellent glue for foam. Once you super glue foam together, that's it, forget it, it's never coming off. One, that adds the added challenge of being a little bit more careful with your placement, but two, what that does is causes pretty much a permanent bond so that those beautiful details on your sword aren't going anywhere. I ended up making this blade pointy, which for me is pretty important for any of my props. I know that it's questionable in terms of what is or isn't allowed at conventions, but no, this is made out of a wooden yardstick, so it's very safe, and the convention that I went to did allow me to take it in. Although I made this mostly without tools, the one tool that I really couldn't live without was a Dremel, so I did go and buy one. I used a Dremel to sand in a point at the end of the sword on both sides until it was smooth. Of course, starting with a heavy grit, like an 80 grit, and then going down to 100 and then 200, etc. And then I went over it with sandpaper. Now, instead of just sandpaper, since that was very painstakingly long, if you have a mouse sander, like the Ryobi mouse sander, it's a great tool for getting your blades smooth if you're making them out of wood. That, in a nutshell, is how I made my Rakuyo sword from Bloodborne. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to share any details that you may need if you want to use this method to make yours. To me, this was super important to share how to make this in a budget-friendly way. I've never used Worbla, and I know that Worbla can be a little bit expensive, so I really do stick to my craft foam and wood method a lot of the time. Although I'm sure that if I had used Worbla, I would endorse it because it's a plastic that absolutely hardens. I think that's such a cool material. I simply haven't used it yet because I'm ancient. Because this bitch is an old hunter. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, feel free to give me a thumbs up and comment down below. I would really love to hear your feedback. Thank you again so much for watching and have the best day. Oh, my pheasant. But you can hear my gloves for like 10,000 miles away. If you want to keep it together before screwing, you can, if you, it's done, it's done, it's done, it's done.